Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today on Central Booking, Connecticut's own Jamie Beck, USA Today and Wall Street Journal best-selling author. Jamie's newest novel, Take It From Me, is a standalone story about two women who have the potential to become unlikely friends if only they can get past their differences. Wendy is a married empty nester who is struggling to come to terms with a shame she thought she'd overcome, kleptomania. Harper is a recently single feminist writer who hopes a stint in suburbia will serve as the catalyst for her comeback novel. And while each possesses life experience and perspective that might help the other, the secrets they keep hold the potential for heartache. While Jamie's dreams of writing date back to her childhood, she decided to pursue a more pragmatic career first, earning a joint law and MBA degree from Tulane University. She then spent a decade practicing real estate and lending law. It was only after her husband's work brought their family to Connecticut that she began putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard with the goal of publication. Jamie has now written 18 novels across the romance and women's fiction genres. Regardless of whether they're series or standalone, the stories share themes of family, love, redemption, and self-discovery. In addition to hitting the bestsellers list and earning her a spot on the Romance Writers of America's Honor Roll, Jamie's books have sold millions of copies and won a National Reader's Choice Award. Take It From Me continues that tradition of excellence. Best-selling author Camille Pagan praised clever, insightful, and brimming with empathy, Take It From Me is Jamie Beck at her best, a potent reminder that we are able to know the interior lives of those we care about if only we can find the courage to ask. Now, Jamie Beck talks about creating fictional stories from essential truths. If you've ever wondered just how that's done, dare I say, you can then take it from her. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Central Booking. I am excited today to be chatting with Connecticut's own Jamie Beck, who is a USA Today and Wall Street Journal bestselling author. Her newest novel, Take It From Me, is available right now. Welcome to the show, Jamie.
Thanks for having me.
So nice to have you here. And I have to say, I loved this book. It was a total palate cleanser for me because people tend to know me as like the mystery man. And so it's murder and mayhem and all this dark stuff. But I mean, I will read anything. And I love a good story, well told, which this certainly is. But it was really a nice change of pace for me, especially because it's sort of Halloween season right now. So my reading has been even darker. And this brought some levity to it, which is always nice to have. So thank you for that. And so I thought I would actually start with the title, Take It From Me, because it works on so many levels. I mean, it is a very apt title. And to set up the book, basically, it's the story of two women who become next door neighbors, unlikely friends, because they're from different backgrounds, different generations. And really, each person wants something from the other person, consciously or not. So I'm wondering if you can tell me what it is that they're hoping to gain from that other person, Wendy and Harper. And then after that, we'll come back to what they can give to the other person. But firstly, what are they hoping to take away from this sort of new friendship?
Well, Wendy, who is the older character, the recent empty nester, and she has a very sort of closeted life because of the way that she goes about coping with her mental health issue. And so when her former neighbor moves away, who was her one sort of true friend, and her son moves away, which is where she was pouring all her energy, that kept her days sort of, well greased and busy. She has too much alone time and not any place to put all this energy, which is a trigger for her issue. And so when she sees this new neighbor move in, her first glimpse of this neighbor, she thinks, oh, this is a woman who needs my help. Like, she's new to town, she's younger, she looks kind of a mess. And Wendy sees her as being in need of some good counsel from a older, wiser woman. And so she thinks this will be the thing that she can pour some energy to, make a new friend, help this woman learn the ropes, and that will sort of reduce her anxiety about the other things. Harper, who is the young 30-something who moves in, is a writer whose career skyrocketed with her debut, but her third book was a big dud and very poorly critically reviewed. And so she's suffering from sort of paralysis. And then her next manuscript that she turned in was rejected by her editor as being too much like, what had just failed. So her editor strongly suggests that she try writing like a funny suburban story. And Harper has left the suburbs well behind. So she comes back to them to try to infiltrate the community and see if she can get some inspiration or a muse. And so when she meets Wendy, that's her muse, but she's not telling anyone who she really is or what she does, because she wants them to behave like they normally would, and feels that if they know that she's a writer and she's there to write a book about this kind of community, that people will like be on their best behavior and she won't really get the skinny. So that's what they want from each other at the outset. So the friendship is not genuine at the beginning, because they really are using each other for their own purposes.
Sure. And it's an interesting dynamic. And as you mentioned, the friendship sort of develops throughout the book, but initially, each person is sort of weary of the other because they come from such different backgrounds. They have such different ideas. And yet they start to realize that, okay, maybe some of what Wendy is telling me does apply to my life or should apply to my life, and vice versa. Maybe something Harper is sharing is something that Wendy should be considering. And I love, the structure of this novel is alternating perspective. So you go back and forth between the two characters, and you realize that one really does start to influence the other in subtle ways, even though they don't initially realize it. So I'm wondering if you can, talk about that narrative structure and how that allows us as the reader to see what these characters are gaining from one another, even though, the other person doesn't necessarily realize that anything they're saying is worthwhile at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, because I started writing romance novels, when I started my writing career. And so in those, the common structure is the alternating hero and heroine points of view. And so when I moved into writing women's fiction, I started with a sister story, and then I had a multi-generational story and so forth. So it seemed natural to me to give the important characters in the story their own perspective. So that's one reason for that choice. And in this case, yes, you have these two women with very strong opinions about right and wrong and how a woman should live her life or behave with other people. And they each want that other one to see that they're right. And part of the inspiration for this was also, we're living in a time where people are very opinionated and they're sharing those opinions online, and not just about politics, but anything. You can almost look up anything and everyone's there with their opinion, and they're so intent on talking, but not so much on listening. And so that was sort of another element. This was written during the pandemic when, people had strong opinions about that as well. And I just thought, I think it's important to try to come up with a story that teaches us that it's okay to listen to someone who differs from you. And there might actually be something that you can learn. You might not wholly accept everything that they're going to say or tell you, because we are different and we have different needs and different ways of moving through the world, different personalities, but there might be some value. And so that was part of the goal of this story, was to sort of raise that question. And so by having the two perspectives and watching them, you get to see what they're trying to accomplish when they're in their perspective, but you also then get to see their reflection on what just happened in the previous chapter and how slowly that starts to shape their behavior, or shift some of their behavior, particularly with Harper, who had a not so good relationship with her very traditional parents, and Wendy, who's a more traditionalist, and her husband, the way that she dealt with her husband and her mother gets, changed because of Harper's sort of feminist, very staunch feminist views, start to, percolate a little bit with Wendy as she realizes that she has more maybe power than she realized. So, that was, fun for me to write that kind of stuff.
Sure. And it's nice too to see that, you can find common ground. It doesn't mean that you have to make some extreme diversion from this end to that end, but there usually is an in between if you're willing to find it. And it is nice to have characters, who recognize that and do make some subtle changes. And speaking of characters, I did want to ask you, these are so well developed, so nuanced. There's a lot of texture. You really do get background information about their families, who they are, where they come from, why they are the way they are. And I feel
Yeah.
like you've been having a lot of conversations lately about sort of like transgenerational trauma and things that, pass down from grandparents to parents to children. But I'm wondering if you can just give us sort of a brief background of Wendy and Harper, what the relationships were like in their own families and how that trickles into their current existence. And then too, how important is that for you to know, as an author before you start to tell the story? How much character development do you do at the outset?
Okay, so I'll answer that part first so I don't forget about it, which is I do a lot of that right at the beginning. So I do a lot of the character work at the beginning, and I have a pretty detailed outline when I start to write, mostly because that's, for me, the best way to hit my deadlines on time is to know where I'm going. That said, I can be very flexible once I get into the story. If I feel like what I thought would work isn't working, I can shift, but at least I've gotten into the flow from the beginning and I do, know the characters. Because for me, all my books are really character-driven stories. They're often about redemption and forgiveness, and you kind of have to know your character if you're writing a character-based story. In terms of Harper and so Wendy's mother was, suffered with OCD, but a very severe case. And I have different mental health disorders in my family and my extended family, I should say. It's ranging from pretty severe or very severe to, more mild. And, but I did, on top of like personal experience with some OCD, also, a lot of reading about it. And I watched a series of documentaries out of Canada about one woman in particular really stuck with me. And this was the woman who couldn't even hug her own child and stuff because her germophobia was so severe and it ruined her marriage and it, really hurt her children. And she was torn about it. Like, she was devastated that she knew she was hurting her children and yet just could not, really breach that gap. And so by giving Wendy's mother this extreme version of that, it allowed me then, as I was doing research about Kleptomania, which is Wendy's, which is not giving away a spoiler because it's basically right in the back cover. So Kleptomania is within that OCD umbrella and often is, it's a rare disorder, but you get it if someone in you're more likely to get it if someone in your family has it or a closely related thing. So that was the reason for giving her that background. And it also set Wendy up for being a little bit more of a pleaser. Her dad left her mom because he couldn't deal with the illness. And so Wendy then felt like hers also could cause her to lose her marriage. So she was very solicitous, and whatever with Joe, and she hid things from him because she was afraid if he knew the full scope of things that he would leave like her dad left and stuff. So it was really setting up, how would a woman, a reasonably educated woman of her age in this era, when there's this effort to tear down stigma, still feel so stigmatized, so afraid to be honest. And even the people that love her, that she was afraid to be fully authentic with. And so that was sort of the workup of her backstory. And part of her work was changing her relationship with her mother or just accepting things. And then obviously being able to confront Joe more directly. Harper, conversely, where would might this, aside from, her age and society, forming her, giving her a stronger feminist bent than people, from a slightly older generation, giving her the background of being raised in a very conservative Ohio suburb, having had the situation that she had with her friend who, was accosted at a party, and not believed or blamed, that whole story that we have seen forever. And that like even her own parents who knew both parties, in that scenario, wanted to sort of default to like, well, why was she was underage? If she hadn't been drinking, she wouldn't have been in that situation. If she, again, like blaming the victim kind of stuff. And that really crystallized for Harper at a young age, like, wait a minute, this is wrong. And then going to a very liberal school like Oberlin would have also, fed into her anger about that past situation and her sense of injustice. And so that sort of forms her. And then she goes to New York to be a writer. And so, that's how we get this sort of hardened version of her, part, rebellion against a family that was unwilling to see truth in her mind, and partly from the other external forces, the college she chose, the city she lands in, that would have, again, fostered more of this sort of, more liberal and feminist view of the world. So that's where they're coming from.
Sure. So as people can see, there's quite a lot, at play, but it makes it fascinating to see how these things work out. And I just, you already spoke to this, but I just wanted to say I really appreciated, how you handled, impulse control disorders, OCD, kleptomania specifically, because I would imagine, you want to get it right and you want to be sensitive with people who actually deal with these afflictions. And I know in personal experience, just in things that I've read or seen recently, I've actually, read a few stories and seen a few shows in which kleptomania is a part. But again, these tended to be mysteries, and so it tended to be used more as a plot device than something with more depth or texture. So it was really nice to see the balance of that. So you already spoke to it, you don't need to anymore, but I did just want to say that I could really appreciate as a reader seeing a more nuanced and sort of realistic depiction of that and the trauma and the turmoil that it can actually create.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really important too. I feel like with, a lot of mental health issues, people tend to define the person by that issue. And that's why even with like Wendy's mom, yes, she had this very, debilitating issue, but she was a smart woman. She held a job. She raised her daughter. Like she's a whole person, and she just had this one problem that really, created a lot of hardship for her, but she wasn't sour about it even, she was just doing the best she could in her situation. And same with Wendy, she has kleptomania, but she's also refinishes furniture, and she's a mom and a wife and a good neighbor, a kind person, a, caring person and stuff like that. So it's important to me anytime I've dealt with mental health in different books to make sure that it's, we're all just people doing our best, most of us. And I think that's part two of breaking down the stigma is, people are more than, a label, a job, or a mental status, or a married or single status, or whatever, heterosexual, whatever, labels are not good no matter what the label is. Even good labels like, genius or something, like people are more than that. So we should, make sure that we paint them that way.
Sure. No, I think that's a great point. And I love that, reading a book like this, even if you don't have personal experience with that, I really do think it gives you a sense of empathy and understanding that you might not have otherwise. And I think that that really is one of the most powerful, components of storytelling, is it does give us aspects of other people's lives, opinions, perspectives, experiences that we wouldn't otherwise have had. But now I'm going to ask you about the autobiographical elements that might work. Because these, they are fiction, yes, but people who know you and are reading this book are maybe going to see some parallels. And I thought I'd start with Wendy's character, because she is a mom, she is a wife, she's working through empty nesting. And I know that you mentioned, your kids are getting older, and I'm not sure if you're a complete empty nester now.
I am.
You are. I wasn't sure if it was complete or half an empty nester, but, can you talk about, how experiencing that, watching your children leave the home and sort of flourish in individuals, how you were able to work that into Wendy's feelings and emotions throughout this book?
Sure. So, of course, I'm not either character, but obviously there are little parts of me and people I know in both characters. So this story is actually set in the town where I live now, where I've lived for the last 23 years. So I was very familiar with the setting and the sort of, vibe here and the people and my friends. And a lot of us, of my friends who I made, friends with when our kids were a little baby group and nursery school kids, we're all in the same boat now. All of our kids are in college and some are even out of college. And it is a strange transition, and it's a time of sort of reflection because now my husband was a very involved dad, and I know a lot of dads today are also, very involved that way, but he did work outside the house. Whereas I was working here at my desk. So I was more present on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis with the kids. And I still did the lion's share of the cooking, the grocery shopping, the laundry, the mom tasks. And so when the kids are gone and those tasks shift and lessen, it's more noticeable to me probably than my husband, I think, because of that. And I was very grateful that I had this career. One of the reasons I sort of started writing when I did was anticipating, my kids were in early grade school when I started pursuing this. And I was cognizant of, someday they're not going to need me, and not just the empty nest, but even like, middle school and high school, when they start breaking away from parents and want to spend time with their friends. And I'm going to need something, because I was a lawyer before my kids were born, and I was used to like having stuff to think about. And so like Wendy, I don't do as well when I have a full day with no plan. I need little goals or things to do. So that part of Wendy is like me, the part that needs something, that doesn't like to be idle, and that, did have a space that I had to fill. I started painting. One of the things I did was I started taking art classes and just, doing, bad modern art on my own. But it like took up time, and it was something that I knew I could do uninterrupted, because I wasn't going to have kids, yelling, "Where's my this and that for practice," or whatever. And my husband took up guitar lessons. So we've tried to like find these new parts of ourselves and the spontaneity that we can just sort of do things on the fly now, because we don't have to worry about the kids' schedules or their games or whatever. So, we've tried to fill it in a positive way. I haven't really hit like a real blue period. I'm knock on wood, I take after my mom a little bit, where I just kind of, as each phase of life comes along, I just sort of take it as it is and I keep going. But it was certainly easy to write because my son's bedroom is right across the hall from mine. And I see his bed perfectly made and his room is clean, which is not the case when he's home. So, and sometimes it hits me like, oh, or our phones give us memories 5 years ago, 7 years ago, and another little pang of like, that time's over, and they're making their own opinions, and they'll politely listen to my thoughts, but they don't often follow my advice anymore. So, that's hard. And then Harper, of course, is the writer, and I was able to dump every writer insecurity that not only that I've had, but, I have a lot of author friends, and we have a lot of daily chats through Messenger or, text chats, and the insecurities and stuff run deep with writers, which makes sense because, you pour a lot of emotion into your book, and then it goes out into the world and people say whatever they want about it. And millions of books go out, it seems like every year. And so just all of those things, the comparisons, the worry, the bad reviews that, you can have 100 great reviews, but it's the 2 terrible ones that you just hear on repeat in your head. The doubt when you're writing, when you read a book that's excellent and just beautiful and you think, oh my God, I'll never be able to do that. All of that is totally real. And I'm not, it's not just me, but it was fun to kind of play with that a little bit and put it in there. And then to give her the friend that is, having success when she is not, and how that works too. Like you're genuinely happy for any author because you know how hard it is. And the odds are not in our favor, right? So when any author has success, it's like a great thing, especially someone you care about. And yet when you have lost your mojo, it's like doubly painful, to sometimes see that happening. So you have to check your ego and, do all of that. So it was kind of fun to have Wendy to play with that way. I mean, Harper to play with that way and sort of get that out there. And I think readers like sort of getting a little peek behind the curtain of author's life as well.
Oh,
So
absolutely. She was so much fun to read, and I could relate to so much of it. And I don't write books, but I mean, I think if you write it all, and if there's any kind of potential for public consumption, you do worry about, those things. And I think too, it gives people who haven't written and who haven't worried about putting their work, on public display, an idea of what it really is like for an author, because I think that some people still have those notions that it's very, glamorous and idealized, and it's really not. It's very difficult, I
it's
think, to
not
be any kind
glamorous
of
at all.
artist. Like, you don't just sit at home writing your stories and then magically a year later they show up in a bookstore and they sell 1 million copies and then you get to write another one. I mean, publishing is really volatile. Like, people don't come to publishing for consistency or money, I don't think.
No, no, it's definitely volatile. And, and you're managing relationships, not just with readers who like you, but your agent, your editors, your publisher, your author friends. Like it's an industry like anything else. And, those things ebb and flow as well. You can get into a bad space with your agent and have some uncomfortable conversations, or same with your editor. You can fight over something in a book that they want you to change that you don't want to change. And then, those are the hardest things, because then if the book goes out and something you fought hard to keep becomes a sticking point for readers, you're like, or vice versa, or it's a win. Like, oh, see, I knew that would be the right thing to do. So it's a very difficult career if you don't have a pretty thick skin.
Hey,
So
well, and I just have to say, you've obviously done, look at all these books, you've done pretty well for yourself, and you've managed to, remain quite prolific and pleasant as well. So I think that bodes well for some of
I
us.
have a thick skin, I think one benefit, my parents were, they were, good parents, and they taught me a lot, but they had high expectations, and they were critical in a sense of, not nasty, but sort of like, oh, that's really good. It would be better if you did, like there was always like a little bit more. So I grew up just that seemed normal to me. So I'm pretty good at taking criticism and editorial direction, and, and sometimes if I tend not to read my reviews anymore, but earlier in my career I did. And sometimes the negative ones were just so outrageous. Like, you almost had to laugh because they almost didn't make sense. They were just like, who would even say that? Like, it's just crazy. So, you kind of have to keep in perspective too. You don't know who these readers are, what their preferences are, and what they're bringing to the story. We bring our own baggage as a reader, our own experiences, and that colors how we view the characters. And so I've learned to put it in a better perspective. And part of it is not reading them. I'll look at like the overall average, like, is it doing
Right.
okay? Is generally, doing well? Okay, great.
No, you said it. It's like going down the rabbit hole. You never know with those things.
Yeah.
Um, but I wanted to ask you too, obviously we talked about some autobiographical elements in this book, and the fact that it takes place in New Canaan, where you live. It's a place that you know well. And I feel like a lot of times, writers tend to try to disassociate from their own personal lives in their books. And I'm wondering, do you ever worry that readers, who know you sort of on a transparent or superficial level, might make connections to your fiction that isn't actually there, especially when, you're setting it in your own hometown? Or are you able to completely set yourself
I don't
apart?
know. I guess I don't really think about that. I just,
Probably good.
it's well, because I know I'm writing a fiction. I know I'm putting all the work into making these characters up. And I think, like I said, every author uses, there's a reason, write what you know is a saying. We take things that we experience and we break them down and put them back together somewhat differently. But, I think a lot of writers are introverts to some degree, and also people who like to examine people, right? Like,
Right.
I wanted to be a psychology major. I wasn't, for reasons I won't get into, but that was really what I was interested in. And so for me, like, as I see the world going around, and I move through it, and I come up against things that either confuse me or I think are interesting. Like, why would, especially if someone's very different from me, like, why would they come at it that way when I am coming at it this way? And so that's always like, well, maybe this is something interesting to explore in a story as a subplot or whatever. So it is a little bit about me, but not really about me. You know, it's just about the world. It's about people and how we get along or don't get along, and what motivates us, what we care about, and you know, how we evolve, right? Because every book, every character, well, not every book, because some books have flat characters, like a detective who, you know, the story is really more about the mystery or the plot or the solving the crime. But in any kind of like women's fiction book, you know, the story is really about how a character moves from point A to point B, how they grow, and the new understanding that they end the book with. And so, yeah, so I don't worry too much about it. And I have based certain characters in different books on, you know, elements of friends of mine.
Sure.
So because then it's easy because I can picture them in the story. It makes it a little bit easier for me to kind of also guess, well, how would they react to this turning point or that turning point? And I can think about the friend that I've loosely based a character on. And I can say, well, you know, I know how they'd react, but
Right.
you know, how do I want to shade it for this story, what I'm trying to tell? So it does help.
Yeah, that's fair. And it's funny. I feel like people sometimes take the saying of write what you know very literally, when really it's just you're sort of taking the essence of truth.
Right.
But interesting perspective. So just one or two more questions about this book and then a little bit of background, and I'm going to let you go. I
Sure.
could be here all day, obviously. But, you know, you mentioned earlier that you sort of moved from romance to more contemporary or women's fiction. You know, there are subtle differences there. They're not the same thing. But I'm wondering, you know, for people who like that romance or that love story, there is a bit of that here, both with Wendy and with Harper. One who has the potential for a new love, and then Wendy, who's maybe trying to rekindle her marriage a bit. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to that briefly for people who are specifically looking for the love story elements of this book.
Okay, so in this book, yeah, I would say there's a little bit of a romantic thing more for Harper. Wendy's story is more of a marriage in trouble, which isn't necessarily a favorite element for people who really like romance novels. That's a little bit of a hard one because they like more the sort of fairy tale, like the lead up to the commitment versus the problems that happen in a real relationship long after that commitment was made. But in Harper's case, that was fun because, of course, Wendy's meddling and playing matchmaker, and she has a history of having some success. And so, you know, of course, she pairs Harper with the total opposite because Wendy thinks opposites attract, that they balance each other and all of this. And so that brings in this character, Nate, who is a really nice guy who, again, I played a little bit with, like, don't judge a book by its cover, that Nate, he does have some sort of, you know, he has a conservative job. He works for the town in the finance department and he dresses conservatively, but he surprises Wendy with some of his ideas about things, his sort of laid back way of dealing with things, some of his own dreams for his life, take her by surprise. So she learns, like, oh, you know, I shouldn't judge a book by its cover, you know, even though I'm running around telling people that all the time, I'm doing it. And so, you know, Harper has come out of a long-term open relationship that she hadn't maybe recognized that she was more committed to than she realized. And so when that guy leaves her for someone else and decides to commit to someone for real, it really rocks her world. And that's part of what rocked her when she was writing the book that tanked. And so, you know, the last thing she wants right now is another relationship when she's trying to write a book, and certainly not with some conservative guy that she can't see herself with. And yet he's attractive, he's charming, and she finds herself sort of getting swept up in it a little bit. But now she's lying to him because he doesn't know who she really is, and he doesn't know that she's stealing things from his boss's wife. And so, you know, she's getting herself deeper into this bind as she's sort of starting to like him, but realizing that now there's this lie between them. So it's a little bit of a fun, that's sort of the romance novel element, right? Like that's the conflict between them, is her lie. And also, you know, he would be more into a more traditional relationship than she is. And she has to decide if that's something that she's interested in or that she's never going to be interested in. So I tried to keep the ending of this book very realistic and not too tidy for either of them, because in this kind of story, I thought it would be inauthentic to have their arcs loop too far around and tie up too clean. So, I try to leave the door open to some different possibilities, and then the reader can slightly fill in how they would like it to be, but no one's force-fed a particular ending with either of them. And even in the romance with Nate and Harper, I think it ends on a positive note, but like a romance novel would, but definitely not a definitive note.
No, I think that's a great point. I loved that it really is realistic fiction and it's not all romanticized. Happy endings, again, it can be like shades of gray or various degrees.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I really liked about Wendy and Joe's marriage, is that you and I know you're married for a long time and there doesn't have to be anything dramatically wrong. And from the outside, it can look like everything's perfect. But I mean, there's always probably some work to do. And you see that here, which is great. And it really is, I think, a reflection of so many people who've been in long-term relationships. But okay, I'm going to move away from that.
Okay.
I did just want to ask you a few more sort of brief, more general questions, but you mentioned, that you spent, I think, a decade, in real estate and lending law, and then you sort of came back to writing, which was a long time, goal and interest of yours. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, coming back to that dream, having the courage and the fortitude to pursue it, and then finding sort of a like-minded community to help you through that transition.
Sure. So when I was young, I wanted to write, but I wanted really to write for television or movies. I was more into like film and drama and dramatic shows and stuff. I loved all that stuff. But I ended up not going down that path for the reasons, largely my parents were not very supportive of that kind of like fuzzy, that didn't seem like a good idea to them. So, I went and I was a lawyer for 10 years and lawyers write all the time. So it honed my writing skills, not creatively, but certainly in terms of like communicating in concise ways and, specificity, things like that. But then when my kids were born, I was very fortunate to have the choice to stop working, so I took that so that I could be part, I was an older mom. I got married in my 30s. And so when I had my kids, I wanted to try to enjoy that, that I knew it would be a short time. But I didn't really want to go back to the law, mostly because you can't really do it part-time. You end up working full-time, getting paid part-time, and it's just not a good situation. And plus you're dealing with miserable people all the time because people don't come to lawyers unless they have a problem. Right. So I thought, well, once they were in grade school, I had basically from like 8 a.m. until about 2:30 free. And I was volunteering at a local mental health, nonprofit here. And I was did many volunteering things at the school and such, but it wasn't enough to really fill my day. So I thought, well, maybe I'll try to write a book, why not? Like I had nothing to lose. So I don't like to say courage or bravery because I was really in a very fortunate position where I didn't have to give anything up. And I actually didn't tell anyone, including my husband, what I was doing. So when no one was around, I would sit at the computer and I started writing a book that's under my bed and will never, see the light of day. It was sort of a YA coming of age story. You can't really call it a romance because it didn't follow the romance genre conventions really well. I broke some rules without really knowing what I was doing. But when I was like 3/4 of the way through, I told my husband and my mother, because then I knew I was going to finish because I was really into it. But, and then when I finished, that's when I started thinking like, oh, well, what do I do now? And maybe I should read some books on craft and maybe I should take some workshops and learn what I was supposed to do. I really just went from gut instinct and sort of the fun. And it was so much joy. It was so fun to write these characters and tell this story. And I'm glad that I did it that way, even though I didn't know what I was doing, because I think had I done it the right way, which would have been to take classes while I was writing it, to read craft books while I was writing it, I would have been so in my head and not at all in my heart, and I think writing fiction, you really have to be able to do both. But I think I would have lost the heart because the lawyer in me, the head part of me would have taken over.
Right.
And I would have been all about craft and this and that, and maybe even gotten a little overwhelmed by the jargon and the this and the rules and blah. So I'm never sorry that I did it backwards. And then I joined Romance Writers of America because I decided I think I want to write a romance novel. My next idea for a story was an unrequited love story, which was the story of my life as a teenager. And so, that's what I wanted to write. And so I joined RWA, Romance Writers of America, and they had a local Connecticut chapter. And so that was sort of my entree into the writing community, or a writing community. I also did workshops at Writer's Digest. They had a big convention every year, and they did one in New York that year. So I went to that. So I started taking workshops and meeting other writers and making friends and joining a critique group, and just sort of slowly, between reading craft books, going to monthly workshops, making friends with other writers who had more experience than me, and so forth, and getting good advice. And the writing community, particularly, I would say the romance writing community, is very generous, very pay it forward community. And people were very willing to share their experiences and sit down and help you with your query letter, or help you with your plot knot, or whatever it was. So it was a very welcoming, energetic community. And I definitely, without a doubt, would never probably have gotten my agent and gotten published without that community, because not just because of what they taught me, like literally taught me about craft, but the energy, the camaraderie, the emotional support. Like I said, this is a lonely business. You sit at a desk in your house or wherever, and you're alone, and you're with characters you're making up. They're not real people, even though they can feel very real. And so that community to me was an invaluable support system. And I totally give them credit for getting me over those early humps into, getting an agent and getting books finished that were publishable quality. Made much better by my editors, but
all collaboration, but
very much.
That's terrific. And on the opposite hand, independent bookstores can be such a force of support, especially when you have a hometown store, which you do. You have Elm Street Books, which actually works its way into a couple scenes and take it from me. So I'm wondering if you just wanted to take a moment to talk about the importance of the indies and maybe Elm Street Books specifically.
Yeah. So Elm Street Books is a really adorable, my town is a very cute. It's like that picturesque. If you were going to make a movie set in Connecticut, this would be the town. It's a pedestrian-friendly village. It's called the Village of New Canaan, God's Acre, which is in the book. I mean, like all of these things. It is my mother and stepfather, when we first moved here, they would visit, and they'd called it Pleasantville. They nicknamed it Pleasantville because it's just like out of central casting. Of course, there's always an underbelly to everything, but just on the surface, it is that. And Elm Street Books is right on Elm Street, which is the main thoroughfare of our little village. And it's just a very friendly, warm place. It is largely, there's a very big children's section because this is a very family-oriented community. But, of course, it has like the window displays with all the new releases and the bestsellers and the hardbacks. And then, it has all the sections, and it has all the little, the staff pick cards all over the place with, their thoughts on the different books, which I love bookstores that do that. Because I like to read what other people have to say. Maybe it'll trigger something, that will make me pick up a book I might not pick up without having seen that or something. So I like sort of seeing and I like seeing what other readers, good readers, people who work in bookstores and libraries are good readers. I like to see what gets them excited too, because that helps me when I'm thinking about next books. Like, if I can see a trend of like, people seem to like this, this kind of an element or this kind of a character. So what can I do that's new and fresh, that's familiar but fresh, that horrifying thing that we all hate to hear, that's like the worst instruction, that I had fun, like that's right up front with Harper when she's being told to write, it's like so vague, but you know it when you feel it, kind of thing. And but Elm Street Books is a lovely bookstore. They do a ton of events with authors, and they pair with our library. to do a lot of author talks, author events, author signings. They're really a good community resource. Where I feel really lucky that we have, them here, and a lot of, so my publisher is an Amazon imprint, which can be a problem. Barnes and Noble generally won't carry our books on their shelves. They'll carry them on their you can order paper books online through them, but they don't tend to carry them in their shelves. And some indie bookstores won't carry the books either, and won't do author events with Amazon publishing authors. And I get where they're coming from. And yet, that's a hard thing for me because, of course, I of course wanted to take a contract with a publisher that wanted to publish my book. And so, it feels like I'm being punished for that sometimes, but I get it. It's, you have this sense of the monopoly and everything. So Elm Street will carry, my books, which is nice. And, but I lost a little track of where we were going with that.
No, I think that's actually a perfect point to just show how supportive some indies can be, because regardless of whether or not an Amazon imprint is the publisher, if your local bookstore is going to stock that book and have you in, I mean, I think that says, everything about them. So that's a great testimonial.
Yeah.
All right. So final two questions, and then I swear I'll let you go. But, there are always people looking for words of encouragement or guidance, because I think so many of us want to write and so many of us find excuses not to. And some of this you may have already shared, but in synthesizing, looking back in terms of a creative or writing life, what do you think is the best advice that you ever got? And then the flip side to that, the best advice that you never got but had to learn for yourself throughout the process of actually doing the work?
Well, the best advice, I guess, that, I did get was to, there's not really a magic to it. I mean, yes, there are going to be some authors who have a more gifted way with prose, let's say, like a special talent, like a poetic way of sort of viewing things and writing. But really, it's really a matter of discipline. It's really a matter of sitting down, nearly every day. I mean, I'm not like a, militant person, but if you want to write a book, I told someone one time, if you wrote 1 page a day, you'd have a book in a year.
It's true.
In less than a year, really. If you just wrote 1 page a day, like 1 page a day is not a lot, right? That's 250 words basically. So it's just taking small bites at a big thing to get it finished. And so that's advice that was given to me and is definitely true. Things that I learned that really helped me, definitely a community. Like COVID wiped out my community, wiped out those face-to-face meetings, and I still haven't recovered from that, and I miss it a lot. But that's really important, finding a community, and not just some people. You can tell in the community, the people who are there only for themselves, that just want to network and they want to take your advice. They want you to pimp their book and promote their new release and stuff. And there are others who are there because they want to make friends, because they have stuff in common with other writers who like to create things, and where it's a give and take. And so you want to put yourself in a community that's more of that than full of a lot of just networking takers. And, it's not just write what you know, it's kind of write what you want to read, right? Like, I'm not a unique person. I'm not a unique reader. So if I have a story that seems like it would be interesting or resonate with me for some reason, or if there's something I think is important to talk about, chances are there's other people out there who are going to think like I do and think that it's important to talk about, or it's going to resonate with them or hit them in some way. And so write what you want to read, is another thing that I think is sort of how I go about it. And some of my books have been more successful than others as a result of that. I'm the worst judge. Like, my favorite books are definitely not my readers' favorite books. So
of course,
it's so subjective. And that's the other thing. That's the sort of final piece. I think if you're going to do this, you really do have to brace for, I was always a person like, I love rules and structure. That's one reason why, what I liked about the law. And I can work really well in a system where it's clear, and I can excel and succeed in those systems. Because if you tell me what's expected, I will do it or exceed that, and then I'll, move forward. But this career, like a painter or any other kind of artistic endeavor, it's so subjective, even among my writer friends. We'll constantly recommend books to each other. I love this book. You have to read this book. And then I'll read and I'll be like, why do I love this book? And same thing, I will love a book and someone else will pick it up and be like, I totally didn't buy the such and such. And I'm like, really? I didn't even think about that. So I think if you're going to take this on, you have to be prepared that it's so subjective and it may not work out anything like you think it's going to work out. You really have to do it because you just can't not do it. That you just have that story that you want to tell, or this character who's knocking around the back of your head that wants to be on the page, and you take it as far as you can take it. And wherever that goes, that's okay. Like the great thing now is with self-publishing and all these small presses that are out now, and Patreon, people are putting books out chapter by chapter. There's so many ways now that you can be a writer, a published writer, and find readers. I feel like there's really no reason not to try. So I would it's really a fun, rewarding thing, to create something from nothing and have it, have people read it, and you get a letter from someone who, really relates to a character or loved something from the message. And it's amazing that, you can do that just out of your mind. So.
Yeah, that's great perspective. And so final question for you. Now you have this established readership. And so we take a book, like Take It From Me, and we devour this in a few days or maybe even a few hours. And then we sit here and think, what's next? Because, there's always something in the pipeline, but it takes a lot longer to write these things than it does to read them. But for people who are just, hanging on, waiting for the next book, can you give us a brief teaser of what we can expect and when?
I wish that we had the promo copy or a tagline or anything ready. I'm expecting it at the end of this month to see what they come up with. But so I'm not sure what we're going to keep and what we're going to give away, but it's a sister story. It's called The Beauty of Rain. And it's a story. It grew. I can tell you that the inspiration for it came from, this is an author note, so I'm not really sharing anything that readers won't see eventually. I had a very bad year. I had thyroid cancer surgery, and then I had a female surgery I had to have done because of risks. And then they made a mistake in that surgery, and I needed an emergency bowel resection. And I was, they said if I had waited 3 days, I didn't know what was going on. I was just getting sicker and sicker. And so I was very near, a very irrecoverable problem. And then I was in the hospital for 9 days, and it was just a very miserable, horrible experience. And in that time, my son also had a bad accident and needed a surgery that was more involved. It was just his collarbone, but it was broken in like 5 places. Wow. He needed big plates, and I was sick trying to take care of him. And then my father was visiting us. He was at end stages Parkinson, and he was very hard to take care of, and he died that same year. So it was just like a time where when I finally felt healthy, and I sat down to write the book that will come out next, The Beauty of Rain, I was very much it made me really reevaluate how I'm spending my time, who I'm spending my time with, what I want to do. And so the book is largely about that. It's largely about a live now, not when philosophy. And how do we come to that? And again, I have 2 sisters like Wendy and Harper. I have 2 very different women, sisters though. So they were raised in the same house, but still different attitudes, different ways of moving through the world. And one has had some tragic things happen and the other has not, but she's trying to care for her sister through this tragedy, and it's creating stress in her life, and her perfect life is starting to fall apart as a result of some of that. And so it's their story. But there's some things that happen in this book. I don't know how we're going to talk about it without giving stuff away. So I'm hesitant to say much more. Sure. So it's going to be a heavier book, but with hopefully a little bit of light in it, and definitely an uplifting message. an important message, I think, because I think a lot of us get caught, especially here in our country, in this sort of trap of like, what does success really mean? And here in America, I think we still tend to define it, and especially with social media and it's like influencer. How many followers do you have? How many likes do you have? How much money do you have? What is your job important? Whatever that means. And so I think it's really easy to get caught in that. And I think when you have something happen, like what happened to me, a year where just my health, my body's telling me like, hey, we're creating these cells that are not functioning right. So I really started thinking about, maybe I'm not going to have maybe I'm not going to live into my 80s like all my grandparents and everything. Maybe I'm going to only make it to my 60s. Maybe I'm going to get cancer and not be able to like deal with it. So it really changes. You hear this all the time and it sounds so trite. And I just think that when it's you that's facing something scary, you really get it in a different way. And I tried really hard to put that into this book. That's all I can say is, so it might come off as a little heavy or a little, but I'm really trying to tell people this is not just like a cocktail party conversation or a greeting card thing. This is really real. This is our one life that we get. And are you living it the way you want? Maybe you are. Some people are, but I think a lot of people aren't, and they feel trapped, like they can't change. Like I have to do this. I have to do it this way. This is the way I've always done it. This is the way my parents expect it to be done, or this is the way. And that's just not true. Like every day we have a choice of how we want to live our life. And every day you have a choice to change it if you don't like where you're going. So that's what that book's about. And I hope
That is a powerful ending point. And again, I think,
I hope.
I'm so glad to see you come out of that, on the other side in such a bright place, because that sounds like a horrific year. And I think in ways people will certainly, relate to that. I think a lot of people have had particularly bad years recently. But I think there is catharsis in experiencing that through fiction, which is sort of a more palatable lens to come through some of these heavy topics.
Yeah.
And that's what really makes it important. So thank you for, sharing so much of that. And of course, in the meantime, people can take it from me. And there is a lot of laughter and levity in this book, despite, the deep and dark subtext. You will pick this up. You will have a good time with it. It's a nice break from reality. Jamie Beck, thank you so much. And maybe when that next book comes out, we'll get to do this again.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.